In September of 2017, Puerto Rico suffered its most significant natural disaster in the last 100 years. The impact of Hurricane Maria, a huge Category 4 cyclone, a Category 5 at its strongest, with wind gusts of over 155 miles per hour and torrential rain, wreaked havoc on this island. The destruction, it was enormous. Thousands of houses were destroyed and the entire Puerto Rican electricity network collapsed. The island was quite literally engulfed in darkness. As you can imagine, the economic damage was enormous. To give you an idea, today the reconstruction costs have risen to around $100 billion. And that's not all. 7 months later, thousands of businesses remain closed and blackouts are still quite frequent. However, dear viewer, just wait a minute, because Hurricane Maria, well, it's not the whole story. The truth is that the island's problems began a really long time ago. Puerto Rico, they've been suffering a severe economic crisis and a population exodus for more than 10 years. An exodus so great that it threatens the island's very survival. See, after declaring bankruptcy in May of 2017, the situation has become so critical that the island's government is considering moving thousands of prisoners to private prisons in the United States. So why is this? Well, the island's government is even having problems with financing its own penitentiary system, and renting spots in places like Texas or Florida is actually proving to be cheaper. Now hold on just a moment here. I mean, prisoners to the United States, it sounds kind of weird, but you absolutely heard it right. Do not forget that Puerto Rico is a part of the United States. It's not a state, but it's kind of a free associated state.
Buenas tardes!
Puerto Rico. We love Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico. And we also love Puerto Rico.
It is good to be back in Puerto Rico!
And of course, by being a part of the United States, having a tropical climate, a rich history, and beautiful white sand beaches, on which, by the way, Captain Jack Sparrow had some of his most famous exploits, we might think that Puerto Rico has everything required to be one of the most prosperous places in the world. Well, the reality is not so much. The truth is really rather different. So, dear viewer, here's a question for you. Where do you think most Puerto Ricans live? I mean, it sounds like a bit of a silly question, but it isn't, because the answer, it's not Puerto Rico.
The escape.
Yes, at first Puerto Rico may look like a paradise. Good weather, beautiful beaches, wonderful music. However, the island has a huge problem. Every year, thousands and thousands of Puerto Ricans leave the island. See, Puerto Ricans have been US citizens since 1917. They are Americans, and they can move freely around that country. Well, according to data from the Pew Research Center, during the last decade, more than 500,000 Puerto Ricans have left Puerto Rico to move to the continent, to places like Texas, Florida, New York, and Pennsylvania. 500,000 people is an absolutely huge number for an island that has just over 3 million inhabitants. Seen in another way, only in the last 10 years, 1 of every 7 inhabitants has left Puerto Rico. Remember the question I just asked? Where do you think most Puerto Ricans lived? Well, the answer is that since 2006, there are more Puerto Ricans living in the continental United States than there are on the island. Specifically, more than 5 million compared to just over 3.
We are watching a real-live demographic and population collapse on a monumental scale. Lyman Stone, an independent migration researcher and economist at the U.S. Agriculture Department.
And things, well, they could get much, much worse. The island's own government expects, just in 2018, for another 200,000 people to leave the island. This means that Puerto Rico will lose about 6% of its population in a single year. So if you thought this process, this exodus, was already severe, well, the consequences of Hurricane Maria, they've only accelerated it. Different estimates, both from the government and from private consultants, expect another 500,000 Puerto Ricans to pack their bags and move to the continent in the next 5 years.
I'm very attached to my island, and my preference is to stay here, but I have to think about what's best for my son. Victor Dominguez, a 39-year-old mortgage banker, to the Washington Post.
As you may imagine, such a flight will have very serious consequences for the island, especially because most of those who are leaving are young. In fact, it is estimated that half of all immigrants, of all people who leave the island, are under 24 years of age. So what's the result of all of this? Well, in the next decade, Puerto Rico's population will decrease to 2.5 million people. That is to say, in the next decade, Puerto Rico will lose 800,000 inhabitants, 25% of its population. And if another natural disaster, another hurricane for example, occurs, or if the island fails to recover from the severe crisis it's going through, the reality could be even worse. I mean, can you imagine what this will mean for the island's economy? Who's going to pay its huge debt? Who's going to pay for its pensions? But I think at this point in the video, we need to ask a question. Why do so many Puerto Ricans leave the island? These statistics seem to be similar to that of a country going through a war. So what's going on? Well, listen to this.
A very long crisis.
So, if we take a look at the data, the explanation seems very clear. Almost half of Puerto Ricans living on the island are considered poor by US standards. The average family income is just $20,000, which is slightly less than half of the average income of Mississippi, the poorest state in the continental United States. But that's not all. The island's government is bankrupt, and it has a huge public debt, $70 billion and another $50 billion in payment commitments, like, for example, its pensions. Remember that we're talking about an island of just over 3 million inhabitants, so that's really an insane amount of money. This means that an average family would have to devote 6 years of their salary to pay off the public debt. So now you might be able to understand why Puerto Rico is known as the Greece of the Caribbean. And if you think this is the worst of it, well, you're absolutely wrong. The worst part is that there's hardly any work in Puerto Rico. In fact, the island has the lowest activity rate in the United States. Only 4 out of every 10 adults are actively looking for work. And if we don't count the people who don't have a job in the public sector, whose salaries come out of the taxes the people who work in the private sector provide, the result is pretty alarming. Less than a quarter of the island's inhabitants work in the private sector. By the way, one of Puerto Rico's great problems is precisely this: public employees and officials. See, almost 1 out of every 4 jobs on the island corresponds to the government, and that's not the worst part. Did you know that many of these public employees had the right to retire at the age of 50, which is 15 years earlier than in the rest of the United States? And if you want things to get even more terrifying, you can also keep in mind that given the high percentage of young people leaving, the island's population is aging very, very quickly. In other words, if things don't change, Puerto Rico will enter a very, very difficult situation. But okay, I'm sure at this point in the video you're wondering, well, how on earth can the island get out of this mess? Is there really a way out for Puerto Rico? Well, let's have a look.
How to get out of this?
It's often said that those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it, and indeed this might happen in Puerto Rico. When we talk about how local politicians see the future, we find some good things, but also some not so good things. Puerto Rico has gone bankrupt, that's a fact, and if they continue like this, the government could push the island into the abyss. So for one, public spending has to be cut. They have to stop the drainage that has caused such a huge amount of public debt. And in principle, the new government, Ricardo Rosselló, is working on this. In fact, he's committed to decreasing the government's size by a lot. The problem is, how he wants to do it isn't exactly clear. Indeed, it's not really clear if there's a real political will to correct the island's massive problems. For another, Puerto Rico has to turn its economic policy around and set some serious plans in motion in order to attract investments. This is because Puerto Rico needs decisive measures. It needs real reforms and not just cosmetic changes. A few things have been done in recent years. For example, they are trying to turn Puerto Rico into a kind of financial center that guarantees anonymity to international investors. This could work, but there's still a really long way to go. Now, before we end today's video, we still have to ask a very important question. How on earth did Puerto Rico get to this point? Well, one reason was that local governments spent huge amounts of money to hire, as we saw, many public workers, and to fund expensive projects that didn't give the island anything other than more debt. The other reason has a lot to do with influence from the United States, but that's something we're going to tell you about in an upcoming video. For now, it's your turn, because I want to ask a question of you. Do you think that Puerto Rico should continue to belong to the United States, or do you think they should seek to become an independent country? Well, you can leave your answer in the comments below as well as in this survey, and I really hope you enjoyed that video. Please do hit like if you did, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for brand new videos every Monday and Thursday. Also, don't forget to check out our friends at the Reconsider Media podcast. They provided the vocals in this episode that were not mine, and as always, thank you for watching.
Buenas tardes.
Puerto Rico. We love Puerto Rico.